America, September 11th dawns crisp and clear. It is one of those late summer mornings when almost anything seems possible, except what is about to happen.
Come on.
The president is in Sarasota, Florida, on a two-day swing to promote his education agenda. He goes for his usual early morning run.
Sure about tax cuts? Not right now.
And in New York City, here at ABC. Good morning, America. How nice to see all of you. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer. It's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001.
And looking pretty good so far. We've got 60 degrees at Dulles Airport, 66 at Reagan National today.
In Washington, everyone is talking about Michael Jordan, and will he return to pro basketball?
WTOP News Time, 8:31.
But at that very moment, in the headquarters of the Northeast Air Defense Sector in upstate New York, something is amiss.
I have FAA on shout line, Boston Center. They said they have a hijacked aircraft.
NEADS, as the Air National Guard installation is known, is part of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, and Colonel Bob Marr is in charge.
I was already in the battle cab that morning. We had the fighters with a little more gas on board, a few more weapons on board.
On this morning, they are in the midst of a full-scale training exercise. Normally, there would be only a handful of military fighters on duty across the U.S.
We had 14 aircraft on alert, 7 sites, 2 aircraft at each site.
At a command center at Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida, Major General Larry Arnold hears about a bogey, an unidentified aircraft.
First thing that went through my mind was, is this part of the exercise? Is this some kind of a screw-up?
Back in upstate New York, Master Sergeant Maureen Dooley is supervising radar operations.
We have a real hijack going on, so then, you know, boom. We're all in the urgency.
Lieutenant Colonel Dawn Deskins is the mission crew chief for the exercise.
And I picked up the line and identified myself to the Boston Center controller, and he said, we have a hijacked aircraft, and I need you to get some sort of fighters out here to help us out.
So what I did was call General Arnold, said, boss, I need to scramble Otis.
And I said, go ahead and scramble them, and we'll get the authorities later.
At Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts, 2 F-15 fighters are at their battle stations. Engines quiet, cockpits empty.
Right about that same time that I was making that call, American Airlines Flight 11 Heavy was crossing the border from Massachusetts into New York, and he turned off his transponder.
Top guns, with the code names Duff and Nasty, wait for orders. The radio crackles.
He said, it's Otis Tower, something about a hijacking. He said, this looks like the real thing.
The pilots fire their engines and roll onto the runway. At NEADS, radar operators desperately search for American Flight 11.
At this point, we don't really know where the aircraft is. We just know that the FAA has lost contact.
Its transponder is off, so the airliner no longer signals its identity, altitude, or speed. The 767 is lost amid the clutter of more than 2,500 planes in the air this morning over the Northeast alone.
We were going by the old-fashioned method of what was his last known speed, his last known heading, his altitude, and we were trying to kind of map it out on the scope.
I hate to say it, but that was probably a perfect tactic, because it's a perfect arrow right to lower Manhattan.
It is 8:46 a.m.
This is an ABC News special report.
Good Morning America was in progress in the East Coast and the Midwest, but we're joined by the entire network just to show you some pictures at the foot of New York City. This is at the World Trade Center.
Pretty dramatic picture we're looking at right now. Fire in one of the World Trade Center towers in New York City.
As I look at it now, there's a diagonal angle across the building at about a 45-degree angle, and it looks like just a definite gash. The upper right-hand side looks like it's the corner of a wing that just went straight into the building.
There's quite a lot of damage. If it was an airplane, it had to be huge.
Breaking news now on 1010 Wins. This just into our newsroom. A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
At that exact moment, the president's motorcade arrives at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, for a long-planned event. Simultaneously, the pagers of his aides erupt in a cacophony of beeps and tones.
It goes into the school. Carl Rove and I and some others were standing there and informed him of this, in which he, being a former pilot, had kind of the same reaction, going, was bad weather? And we said, no, apparently not.
The president was surprised. He thought it had to be an accident.
The president ducks into an empty classroom and calls National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice back in Washington.
He said, it sounds like a terrible accident. Keep me informed.
In the command center in New York, a TV set shows the World Trade Center on fire.
And the immediate assumption is that that guy that we couldn't find probably hit the World Trade Center.
But the FAA still lists American Flight 11 as unaccounted for.
They told us that they showed the American Airlines Flight 11 was still airborne. So now we're looking at this, well, if an aircraft hit the World Trade Center, who was that?
Whoever it is, Colonel Deskins knows she needs to call NORAD operations in Florida to inform the public affairs officer, Don Arias.
And his reaction to me at that point was, my God, my brother works in the World Trade Center. And I said, well, you have to go call your brother.
Arias hears the shock in his brother's voice.
So, not the typical phone voice I expected, you know, and he was just like, hey, you know, he's heard a lot of background noise. He says, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on here now.
The Air Force officer is a former New York City firefighter, so he knows what his brother is up against.
He says, you're not going to believe what I'm looking at here. I said, what? He says, people are at the windows. He says, there's a guy falling out of the building next door. He says, there are people jumping. And I said, you know, I think I just got a call from the Northeast Air Defense Sector. There's a hijacked plane. I think that's the plane.
At that same moment, 3 blocks from the White House at the St. Regis Hotel, 2 old friends meet for breakfast at a window table. George Tenet is the Director of Central Intelligence. His companion this morning is David Boren, the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
And out of the corner of my eye, I could see several people converging on our table. And I remember one of them said to George Tenet, Mr. Director, the World Trade Tower has just been attacked by an airplane. And I was struck by the fact he used the word attacked.
An aide hands the CIA director a cell phone.
And after he handed the cell phone back to his security person, he said to me, you know, this has bin Laden's fingerprints all over it.
At their air base in Massachusetts, Duff and Nasty rocket into the air at 8:52 a.m., just 6 minutes after the first tower is hit.
As we're climbing out, we go supersonic on the way, which is kind of non-standard for us. And Nasty even called me in the actuator and said, hey, Duff, you're super. I said, yeah, I know. You know, don't worry about it.
I was kind of wondering why he was going so fast. We really didn't have verbal authorization to go supersonic.
The fighters are hurtling toward New York at Mach 1.2, nearly 900 miles per hour. They are 153 miles from the World Trade Center.
I just wanted to get there quickly.
We were going as fast as we could.
I call for bogey dope, and they say, your contact's over Kennedy. So, okay, I know where that is, so we start heading right down Long Island, basically.
10 more minutes pass.
There's a great deal of smoke billowing from the tower still. We can see flame coming out from at least 2 sides of the building. I can't see around to the other side. Brian, were you able to tell us the size of the airplane? Was it a small plane, a commercial plane? Do you have any idea at all?
I will tell you from the size of the gash that the wingtip had to be at least 150 to 200 feet wide. Oh, my God!
Oh,
the next building
there's another one.
Oh, my God.
That looks like a second plane. We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
The second tower has exploded from about the 20 stories below in a gargantuan explosion.
So this looks like it is some sort of a concerted effort to attack the World Trade Center that is underway. Jet fighters are still 60 miles away. It is just 16 minutes since the attacks began.
Call for bogey up again, trying to get some information. And at that point, they said the second aircraft just hit the World Trade Center. That was news to me. I thought we were still chasing American 11.
There was smoke from fire blowing southeast towards New Jersey.
I had my head down, basically looking at the radar scope, and we were about 60 miles out. I could see the smoke from the towers. So at that point, obviously, everything changed.
When the second aircraft flew into the second tower, it was at that point that we realized that the seemingly unrelated hijackings that the FAA was dealing with were in fact a part of a coordinated terrorist attack on the United States.
At the Pentagon, Brigadier General W. Montague Winfield is in the loop with the Air Defense Command, and he alerts the Pentagon brass.
The senior military and civilian leaders in the building began to filter into the National Military Command Center to get a situation update. And as you can imagine, the reports were numerous and conflicting. We would get duplicate reports, and we would get bogus reports.
In Florida, President Bush is in the middle of a reading lesson with second graders. He doesn't know about the second crash. Ann Compton is covering the president this day.
It all came to a blinding moment of realization when the president's chief of staff walked over to the president and whispered to him. Nobody interrupts the president, not even in front of a second-grade classroom.
I tried to be very efficient with my words. I knew that this was not the place to stand and have a conversation with the president. I said, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. And then I backed away from the president.
And the president's eyes got wide, and the face told it all. Something terribly grave, something terribly serious, something beyond imagining.
I think there was a moment of shock, and he did stare off, maybe for just a second.
So much so that I wrote it down in my reporter's notebook by my watch, 9:07 a.m.
The president stays calm and lets the students finish.
Yeah, the president thought for a second or two about getting up and walking out of the room, but the drill was coming to a close, and he didn't want to alarm the children.
Instead, Bush pauses, thanks the children,
Thank you also very much for showing me your reading skills.
and heads for the empty classroom next door.
He came back into the holding room. We had found a television, so we brought a television in so we could see TV, and they were replaying the crash over and over again.
And next to him, as he's walking by in the classroom, you can see on the TV monitor the building's burning.
White House photographer Eric Draper is with the president this day. His job is to chronicle Bush's every move, in public and in private.
We're seeing the video of the second plane hitting the second building for the first time. And that's why you see Dan Bartlett pointing to that video.
You almost can't believe what you're seeing, and just instinctively just pointed at it. And but at that point, the president briefly looked back at the images.
The president said, I'm going to need to make a statement before we leave here.
He was red, and I seen that he had tears in his eyes, so I knew something bad had really, really happened. His face was just red, and his lips were just trembling. He kind of stuttered when he talked, and he kind of said it all slowly.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Quick goodbyes, and then a race to the Sarasota airport. At that moment, in the White House,
I was in my West Wing office.
The Secret Service had come in to his office. I think it was 2 or 3 agents, which is very unusual.
David Borer is another White House photographer, assigned to Vice President Dick Cheney.
And agents came inside the office and said, sir, you have to come with us.
Put his hand on the back of my belt, grabbed me by a shoulder, and sort of propelled me down the hallway.
And to an underground bunker, the President's Emergency Operations Center, PEOC they call it.
It's got blast doors on each end to secure a phone there, as well as a television set.
Up above, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice is trying to find the rest of the President's team. Secretary of State Colin Powell is in Peru. Attorney General John Ashcroft is in the air. And Federal Emergency Management Agency Director Joe Albaugh is at a conference in Montana.
As I was trying to find all of the principals, the Secret Service came and said, you have to leave now for the bunker. The Vice President's already there. There may be a plane headed for the White House. There are a lot of planes that are in the air that are not responding properly.
In the bunker, the Vice President is joined by Rice and Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta.
Someone came in and said, Mr. Vice President, there's a plane out 50 miles.
Mineta confers with Federal Aviation Deputy Chief Monty Belger.
And so I said, Monty, what do you have? He said, well, we're watching this target on the radar, but the transponder's been turned off, so we have no ident. We have no identification.
At the FAA's Air Traffic Control Center near Washington's Dulles Airport, Danielle O'Brien is at a radar scope.
It was an unidentified plane to the southwest of Dulles, moving at a very high rate of speed.
Someone came in and said, Mr. Vice President, airplane's 30 miles out.
We caught on the radar scope a few blips, maybe 7 or 8, just enough to kind of go around in a half circle and then fade right over, losing radar contact right over Washington. I said, my God, what is that?
He was fast, and it would be unprecedented for a commercial plane to come screaming through your airspace at that kind of speed, unidentified, without making some type of communication.
We knew that he was headed in that direction, and we were calling Washington Center. Oh my God, he's coming towards you.
The fellow came in and said it's 10 miles out, assuming that it was coming into National Airport, Ronald Reagan National Airport.
At Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, F-16 fighter pilots Brad Derrick and Dean Ekman scramble into the air. They are 105 miles, 12 minutes south of Washington. It is just 9:30 a.m.
We were directed to go in which turned out to be Reagan National, which is right by the Pentagon.
Our supervisor picked up our line to the White House and started relaying to them the information. We have an unidentified, very fast-moving aircraft inbound toward your vicinity, 8 miles west, 7 miles west, and it went 6, 5, 4.
And he said, uh-oh, we just lost the bogey, meaning the target went off the screen. So I said, well, where is it? And he said, well, we're not really sure.
I happened to look up to my left, and there is the airplane. The airplane is about 25 feet above the ground, and it's about 150 to 200 yards away and coming at us.
It is 9:38. Just 52 minutes have passed since the first attack. Firefighter Alan Wallace is on duty next to the helicopter landing pad on the west side of the Pentagon.
I look up and see the airplane. I hear the noise from the airplane, and bang, the airplane hits the building. And that's how fast it happened. The whole building jumped.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is on the 4th floor of the Pentagon, around the corner from the impact.
The table shook and the building shook, and it felt like a bomb had hit the building.
352. I think we just had an airplane crash east of here. It must be in the district area.
White House Claire Shipman is on the phone. Claire, what's that we're looking at?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out right now.
I'm direct, and there is visible smoke coming from that area. High visible smoke.
Any unit responding to check the area of the Pentagon, advised on channel 1.
American Airlines plane headed east down over the pike, possibly for
the Pentagon. A plane has crashed into the Pentagon.
I don't believe I was knocked down, but I did at a certain point when I thought I was on fire. I thought I had ran as far as I should run, and then I hit the ground.
I went downstairs and went outside and around the corner, and of course there it was.
Everything around the fire truck and the fire station, including the blacktop that surrounds the fire truck, was on fire. There were trees along the side of the Pentagon the leaves were on fire.
There was metal all over the grass, and there were people coming out of the building hurt, and people were assisting them.
Almost directly behind the fire truck, that there are people trying to get out of the building, and there is someone back there who is trying to help them.
Other firefighters from nearby Fort Myer and Arlington, Virginia, join the rescue efforts.
From the time we first assembled there, I would say 30 seconds later, there were probably 30 people there. And 30 seconds after that, there were probably 100 people there.
Among those helping the wounded and injured is the 69-year-old Rumsfeld himself.
There was a young woman, bleeding, sitting on the ground, and I think she said to me, she didn't know who I was, she said she could see people holding drips going into people, IV of some kind, and she said something to the effect, if someone could bring that person over, I could hold it.
The Secretary of Defense is outside the burning building, while inside the Pentagon,
for 30 minutes, we couldn't find him. And just as we began to worry, he walked into the door of the National Military Command Center.
Very, very quickly, he's in there in his shirt sleeves, as I recall.
On 9/11, General Richard Myers steps in as acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
It was, from my viewpoint, a very professional scene. There was no panic, no undo alarm.
High overhead, jet fighters arrive. Just moments too late.
We get in closer and I can start to see smoke coming up. I looked down and started seeing the landmarks, and it was obviously the Pentagon was on fire. You know, looking down and actually seeing the Pentagon burning, and you know, big black billowing smoke out of it. Just looking back, and I'm thinking, we're at war.
In the Pentagon Command Center, General Winfield is juggling a secret conference call.
We added the White House, and we added Air Force One to the conference. All of the governmental agencies that were involved in any activity that was going on in the United States at that point were in that conference.
Rumsfeld orders U.S. forces to DEFCON 3, the highest alert for the nuclear arsenal in 30 years.
The smoke got intense at one point. I actually recommended the Secretary, you know, maybe we ought to think about an alternate location.
They wanted to evacuate us in the building, and I decided I'd prefer to stay.
Instead, Rumsfeld sends his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, to a secret remote bunker where there is a duplicate of the Pentagon's command and control system.
We flew them out by helicopter to Site R. The deputy SecDef flew out there, and he was in charge of our alternate site.
Just moments earlier on Capitol Hill, to testify before Senator Edward Kennedy's Education Committee, the First Lady learns about the New York attacks.
Our hearts and our prayers go out to the victims of this act of terrorism, and that our support goes to the rescue workers.
We had walked down the corridor, and just as we were about to get in the elevators, the Secret Service said, is there someplace we can go right away? And we heard that the Pentagon had been struck.
The Pentagon crash literally reverberates in congressional corridors. In under an hour, 3 hijacked planes have struck buildings in New York City and Washington. Police warn the leaders of Congress the Capitol building could be next.
Well, they said, we think there's a plane heading for the Capitol.
Some Capitol policemen broke into the room and said, we're under attack. I've got to take you out right away.
As I looked up, hung up the phone and looked back down the window, out my window and down the mall, this huge cloud of rolling black-blue smoke was coming across.
When I looked out that window of my office, and I could see the smoke billowing up from the Pentagon, and my immediate impression, you know, we're fixing to be hit too, and let's get out of here.
People were just as fearful as I've seen. I saw looks in senators' faces, looks in staff faces I've never seen before.
Get off the sidewalk.
Workers, tourists, senators scattered as word spreads of another hijacked plane.
The plane is heading for the Capitol.
The Senate chaplain offers a prayer.
So, Lord, be with us.
Moving everybody back. Moving everybody back.
I'm thinking to myself, here I am, Speaker of the House, something I never dreamed would ever happen to me, and we're evacuating the Capitol. It just can't be happening to us.
Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert is third in line of succession to the presidency.
I was put in one of our secure automobiles, and the next thing I knew, I was hurtling through the back streets of Washington.
The other leaders jam into a room 2 blocks from the Capitol.
We were in a vulnerable position. We were all in one place, and I started asking, you know, who's in charge here?
We were like everybody else. We were in complete chaos.
I think it might be a good idea if we got out of this crowd situation.
Hey, John, Boyd.
Some leaders rush to the west front of the Capitol where military helicopters await.
Then we flew over the Pentagon, and we saw the remnants of an airplane into the side of the Pentagon with this whole facade caved in with black smoke and thousands of people gathered around. It was a terrible sight.
While in Florida, the president hurries aboard Air Force One.
He was virtually shoved on board the plane. The rest of us being forced to move faster, faster, faster to get on board.
The president sat down in his chair, motioned to the chair across from his desk for me to sit down, and before we could both of us sit down and put on our seatbelts, they were rolling the plane. And they stood that 747 on its tail and got it to about 45,000 feet, but as quick as I think you can get a big thing like that up in the air.
It is 9:55 a.m.
It seemed we were wheels up in nanoseconds.
Ellen Eckert is a White House stenographer.
The chatter in the press section of the plane where I was sitting was, where are we going, and we were looking out the windows trying to see if we could figure out geographically where we were going.
That's what the president is trying to decide up front.
I was focused on getting the president in a safe environment, which meant on the plane, and the plane should be in the air.
And then it became a question as where should the plane go?
He said, I'm coming back. And I said, you may not want to do that, Mr. President, because Washington's under attack. We don't know where the next attack is coming.
Press Secretary Ari Fleischer is keeping notes.
Turned to the head of the Secret Service detail and he said, I want to go back home ASAP. I don't want whoever is doing this to hold me outside of Washington. And the head of the Secret Service detail said to him, our people are saying it's too unsteady still.
There was a little bit of pulling and pushing with him to suggest that we should fly to a secure location and where we could have good communication and then make a decision when he should return to Washington.
When I got to the bunker, the president was talking to the vice president on the phone, and the vice president was saying the same thing. You can't come back here.
At that point, urged him not to return to Washington because it was clear then that an attack included Washington as well.
So it was on the basis of that third plane that you said at that point to the president, you can't come back here.
Right, we don't know what's happening.
On board Air Force One, we seemed to be flying forever, and one of the Secret Service agents leaned over to me and said, look down there. We're at 44,000 feet, and we're not going back to Washington.
Deep beneath the White House, Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta issues an unprecedented order.
Their planes are coming into the eastern seaboard, turn them around and get them going west. If they're going west, have them land at their destination, but in any event, if they're not too far away, have them land.
More than 4,000 planes are in the skies over the U.S. FAA policy allows pilots to use their own discretion to decide where and when they land in an emergency. But on this morning,
I said, screw pilot discretion. Get the damn planes down.
Up above, the Secret Service orders the White House staff to evacuate.
As soon as we were outside, Secret Service agents told us to run. And they kept yelling to run. And if you looked at their faces, they wanted us to run.
Everybody out! Everybody out!
One of them yelled, you know, women, take off your heels and run. Take off your heels and run. And so I did. I took them off and I started running as fast as I could. The gates opened and we all went pouring out.
Dozens of fighters are buzzing in the sky. F-16s scramble at Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland.
We were told to get airborne and protect the Capitol.
I believe there's over 20 fighters, plus tankers, AWACS, you know, the other support airplanes. Total military in the area, I'd say it was probably 30-plus airplanes.
Like never in my wildest dreams occurred to me that one day I'd be orbiting over the Pentagon that had just been hit, looking for possible incoming aircraft.
In the Pentagon Command Center, there's a report of another hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93.
We received a report from the FAA that Flight 93 had turned off its transponder, had turned, and was now heading towards Washington, D.C.
We rapidly developed some rules of engagement for what our military aircraft might do in the event another aircraft appeared to be heading into some large civilian structure or population.
They said if we get another one of these, you're going to have to shoot it down.
You heard the Speaker of the House of Representatives say there, it can't be happening to us so much now that we didn't know then. In the next half hour, you will see how this crisis led the nation's leaders to create rules of engagement for something never before done in American history, ordering the military to shoot down a civilian aircraft.
When we come back, life and death decisions in the skies over Washington.
This is the first time in my career that I ever actually wanted to go out and use my airplane to kill someone.
ABC's coverage of 9/11 will continue in a moment. This one. ABC News, 9/11 continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
Welcome back to our coverage of the first anniversary. In this half hour, we will continue our extraordinary look behind the scenes on the day that America was attacked on board Air Force One with the President at the site of the crash of the hijacked plane in rural Pennsylvania and in the secret bunkers where the government leaders took shelter. Here again is Charles Gibson.
It is just before 10 a.m. Jet fighters swarm around the Capitol.
One whole side of the Pentagon is just completely burning. There's ashes falling, and there's fumes in the air, and the smoke is billowing around.
Only minutes before, the Pentagon was struck by a hijacked airplane.
This is the first time in my career that I ever actually wanted to go out and use my airplane to kill someone.
Only an hour has passed since the attacks began in New York City.
In the defense of the nation's capital, we would have done what we had to do.
But there is little the pilots can do, even though another hijacked aircraft, United Flight 93, is heading for Washington.
At that point, we had no authorization to shoot anyone down.
The president is in his cabin aboard Air Force One.
I was there when he was talking with the Vice President and Secretary of Defense, and this was not an easy thing. It's a decision that can't be made by others other than the President.
Moments earlier, in a hardened bunker beneath the White House, the Vice President is with Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta.
He's just methodical in the way he goes about doing things, but he's very effective in terms of his cool, collected way of getting things done.
I had a yellow legal pad with a list.
Cheney personally compiles a list of possible threats from the air.
It had tail numbers, too.
Of the flights that you didn't know where they were?
That we couldn't account for.
At first, it was one of a few planes that they had questions about.
White House photographer David Borer watches the tense moment and records it on film.
Eventually, it narrowed to Flight 93. That was the biggest threat at that point.
If you take the trajectory of the plane, Flight 93, after it passes Pittsburgh, and draw a straight line, it's going to go to Washington, D.C.
You just had to do something instantaneously.
And there was a PIOC staffer who would keep coming in with updates on Flight 93's progress towards D.C.
Did you have any thoughts at the time as to what the target of that airplane might be?
I thought probably White House or Capitol. We found out later from interviewing people who were detained, al-Qaeda members, that said the fourth plane was intended for the White House.
The decision was made to try to go intercept Flight 93.
The significance of saying to a pilot that you were authorized to shoot down that plane full of Americans is that's an order that had never been given before.
Very, very tough decision, and the President understood the magnitude of that decision.
The President did give the order to shoot down a civilian plane if it was not responding properly. And it was authority requested through channels by Secretary Rumsfeld. The Vice President passed the request. The President said yes.
It was a totally different circumstance for our country. The thought of having to shoot down one of our own civilian aircraft.
Do you remember your own thoughts as to what you were thinking that we've...
Yeah, that this was a very difficult proposition, but it had to be done. If we had been able to intercept the planes before they hit the World Trade Center, would we? And the answer was absolutely yes.
And the President gave the VP authority to make that call. It was a chilling moment.
The Vice President briefed into the conference that the President had given us permission to shoot down any civilian aircraft that threatened Washington, D.C. Again, in the National Military Command Center, everything stopped for a short second as the impact of those words sunk in.
The rules have changed. We could do something about it now.
Colonel Bob Marr is in command at the Northeast Air Defense Sector base in Rome, New York.
I got the call, and the words that I remember as clear as day was, "We will take lives in the air to preserve lives on the ground."
Marr orders his air controllers tell the pilots to intercept Flight 93.
Nothing any controller would ever want to pass to a pilot, to shoot down an airliner filled with innocent people.
And we, of course, passed that on to the pilots. United Airlines Flight 93 will not be allowed to reach Washington, D.C.
The closest fighters are two F-16 pilots on a training mission from Selfridge Air National Guard Base near Detroit.
So we were able to get hold of them on the radios and said, "Hey, guys, we may need you to come down south and try and head off United Airlines Flight 93.
But there's a problem.
The real scary part is that those guys are up there on a training mission. They don't have any weapons on board they can use.
We started receiving reports from the fighters that were heading to intercept. The FAA kept us informed with their time estimates as the aircraft got closer and closer.
First question that came from my mission crew commander, the individual that's in charge of the operations floor, said, "Well, sir, what are they going to do?" I said, "We're going to put them as close to that airplane as we can get in view of the cockpit and convince that guy in that airplane that he needs to land.
And if that doesn't work, without any weapons, what can the fighter pilots do except crash into the hijacked plane?
Well, as a military man, there are times you have to make sacrifices that you have to make.
And at some point, the closure time came and went, and nothing had happened. So you can imagine everything was very tense in the NMCC. We had basically lost situational awareness of where this airplane was.
Flight 93 is about 175 miles north and west of Washington, lying over Somerset County, Pennsylvania.
At about 10 o'clock, I called my sister Jody. I hadn't heard anything from her that morning. And we were talking about what was going on, you know, in New York and at the Pentagon.
Rick King is the assistant chief of the Shanksville, Pennsylvania Volunteer Fire Department and the proprietor of Ida's Country Store.
She said to me, "Rick, I hear a plane." And I said, "Yeah," and she said, "It's really loud."
Just outside Shanksville, Valencia McClatchy is startled by the noise.
Just as I had heard the roar, I glanced out my front window and just caught a glimpse of a reflection of the sun hitting on something.
And I could hear the engine screaming, and seconds later it hit. And I remember the ground just shook.
It almost jolted me to the point of losing my balance.
My sister said to me, "Oh my God, Rick had crashed," and I said, "I know." And I said, "I gotta go."
I had my camera right by the doorway. I grabbed my camera as I was going out the door, opening the door. It's very startling against that clear blue sky to see that huge ball of smoke coming up.
I placed a phone call then to our 911 center in the Somerset.
Terry Schaefer is the Shanksville fire chief.
Pulling into the crash site, I remember just seeing vehicles everywhere, firefighters' vehicles, other fire department vehicles, just a lot of confusion.
But when I got there, you know, I wondered to myself, where is it? You know, there was just, the plane was just totally disintegrated.
It's a smell that you'll never forget, a smell of jet fuel, burnt flesh.
You know, after about the first 5 or 10 minutes, we realized that we didn't have any survivors.
My role is to determine the cause and manner of death, recover the remains, identify the remains, and return the remains to the families. That's my role in every case.
Somerset County Coroner Wallace Miller arrives at the crash site.
So everybody's just kind of walking around. And after a few minutes, I did run into Rick.
He wanted to see what I had seen. And as we were walking through, I remember looking up into the hemlock, into the trees.
You could see all kinds of stuff hanging out of the trees, like socks and pieces of suitcase and luggage and seat covers and seat belts. And
the only thing we didn't see were people.
Nothing to indicate that there was even anybody on the plane.
You know, we're trained to help people. We're trained to rescue people. And we couldn't do any of that.
Up above, a fighter jet streaks by.
It was about, 10:03 that the fighters reported that Flight 93 had crashed.
Eventually, of course, we never fired on any aircraft.
When you heard the plane was down without a shot being fired at it, do you remember what you said?
We just witnessed an act of heroism.
In Washington,
you see the smoke down on the mall.
There is little information.
We just had a few bombings here.
Just rumors.
We know there was a car bomb at the State Department.
The day just didn't end at 93. We were responding to possible hijackings. We had a car bomb reported at the State Department.
It ran on the crawler on the TV that a car bomb had exploded outside the State Department.
Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage is a former Navy SEAL.
I went out and looked with diplomatic security and didn't see anything, and called my colleagues around town and on the video conference screen and said there was nothing to it.
It was frustrating. We flew 7 hours, and the worst part of it was that because of the communications problems that existed during that day, I couldn't talk to anybody in Washington.
Secretary of State Colin Powell is in the air on his way back from Lima, Peru.
There were rumors that the fourth plane might have been hitting, either to the White House or to the State Department. We didn't know. Who could have imagined?
At that moment, you have to worry about the continuity of the United States government. It's very clear that Washington was under attack.
We arranged for the evacuation of the congressional leadership, especially Denny Hastert, the Speaker, who was in the line of succession for the presidency after me. Whatever was going on, that the government of the United States would survive.
Congressional leaders are safe. Aboard military helicopters, they fly to a top-secret bunker.
It was a granite-like stone on the side. I mean, literally there it was, like a cave.
The bunker, part of a nuclear survival plan, equipped with food and phones. A secret State Department report says there are 19 emergency operating facilities for dispersing federal officials located within a 300-mile radius of Washington.
Well, the hope was that the government could go on, but the feeling was that if there was a group of people who would be in a position to make the decision about how the government goes on, it ought to be the leadership, Republican and Democratic, Senate and House.
The president, too, is safe in a protective cocoon at 45,000 feet.
The fear ran so deep that a concept that was a Cold War concept that I had never heard of actually came into play that day, and the fear was that this was an attack whose intent was to decapitate the government. In other words, to take out the congressional leaders, to take out the president, to take out the vice president, so our government could not function. Decapitation.
Was there any talk in the PIAC about the fact that they may be trying to decapitate the United States government?
Certainly that was a thought that occurred to me, and I assume others as well, too. That's in part why, number one, I urged the president not to return until we could find out what was going on. It was important that we not bunch up in Washington.
It was very clear that they were going for symbols of power and for the seats of power. And to bring the president back and to put him in the same building with the vice president would have been foolhardy, frankly, because decapitation then of the U.S. government is quite easy.
But no one in the back of the plane knows where Air Force One is going.
Everybody was looking out going, the plane just took a sudden left. We're definitely not going back to Andrews.
At one point, Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, came back and said, this is off the record. The president is being evacuated. The president being evacuated for his safety and the safety of the country.
TV monitors aboard the president's plane show flickering images of the destruction in New York and Washington.
Some stations would fade in and fade out, so we weren't getting complete reports, just kind of pieces, bit by bit.
It is just 50 minutes since the second tower of the World Trade Center was struck.
You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
It is 9:59 a.m.
The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed. It pulled it down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed. The building has collapsed.
Whew. This is what it looked like moments ago. My God.
Another 30 minutes ticked by.
It's a very strong building, as you remember from the blast the last time, so...
But what does it take as an engineer to do this? Oh, no.
The second and last tower has just collapsed.
The second tower. Both trade towers have now been attacked and destroyed, with thousands of people either in them or in the immediate area adjacent to them.
Duff and Nasty watch from their jet fighters high overhead as the towers collapse.
I kind of just looked back over my shoulder, and I looked and said, man, I called it right away. I said, I can't see lower Manhattan.
I didn't know what to think. There might be some sort of other attack.
So I went up to take a look at it, so I was right over the top of it, looking down. And as I was looking at it, all of a sudden it just started getting smaller. And to me, it didn't make sense. And to see this thing just falling away from me, and then I realized what was going on. It was absolutely the sickest feeling I've ever had in a plane.
Meanwhile, in the White House bunker...
Mood was very somber at that point. I've seen pictures as we sat there and watched on television as you could see that first building collapse.
On Air Force One, reporters recoil in horror.
It's worse than any disaster movie. We'd been in the air for 2 hours, and as the plane was beginning to lose altitude, Ari Fleischer came back and told us, the president is going to keep moving.
We didn't have a full load of fuel. I said, well, the nearest secure facility that we can refuel the plane is Barksdale, headquarters of the 8th Air Force. And so we flew into Barksdale.
Air Force One touches down at the air base in Louisiana. It is just before noon. On the tarmac, Fleischer holds a brief news conference.
I said, for the credibility of this president, not only for the American people, but for the world, you need to have press with you to say this is where the president is and what he's doing. It's not enough to have Air Force One jet off into the sunset and have none of us know where he is.
Surrounded by armed guards, the president goes inside to call the White House bunker.
Got on the phone with the vice president, and he said to him, I can't wait to find out who did it. It's going to take a while, and we're not going to have a little slap on the wrist crap.
Air Force One is refueled. President Bush records a statement to the nation.
Oh, there's no question he was angry. He was hot. It was reflected in his words, and I'll never forget it. His first reaction is, we are at war.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
And I swear his eyes were red-rimmed. Not the crying kind of red rim, but a stress and attention.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Air Force One lifts off again with a lighter load. Aboard are just a few key aides and Secret Service agents. The press pool has been trimmed from 13 to 5.
And Ari Fleischer told us, I can't tell you where we're going. And you got the distinct feeling it's because he didn't know. Because they didn't know.
I remember thinking it was like being on the Twilight Zone plane because there was nobody around anymore.
The fear was palpable. Fear for the country, fear for the structure of the government, agents fearful of protecting the chain of command, the line of succession.
Jet fighters appear just off the wing.
This fighter jet was so close. It was so close I could see the pilot's face. And I had my face, you know, just pressed right up against the little portal window. And I can't tell you, I was instantly calm.
In his cabin, the president wants to get back to the Capitol.
And finally, he just basically said, I'm not going to let, whoever did this keep the President of the United States out of Washington, D.C. We're going.
But first, another stop at Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska. The president and his aides disappear into a tiny brick building and descend to a blast-proof bunker. It is now 3:30 in the afternoon.
Well, you go downstairs, and you go downstairs, and you go downstairs, and you go downstairs. I mean, it's a long way down. And then you emerge and go through a series of hallways and special doors, blast doors, and so forth. And then you enter into a conference center, which is, several stories underground.
I do remember going underground.
White House photographer Eric Draper records the moment as the president convenes a meeting of his national security team on a video teleconference.
Secretary of Defense, the Director of Central Intelligence, the Vice President, myself, Dr. Rice, who was with the Vice President.
And we sat down, and the president said, first of all, let me tell you that whoever did this to us, we're going to get them. George, you get ready. Don, you get ready.
He was ice cool, and I thought very appropriately so.
And I remember the president was saying, we're going to find out who did this. We're going to seek them out, and then we're going to destroy them.
And then he said, and I'll be back tonight. I'm coming back tonight. And he said it in a way that it was pretty clear that there was no arguing with him this time.
The Secret Service didn't want him to come back. And he asked me then what I thought, and I said, I think it's okay to come on back.
Just before 5 p.m., Air Force One is readied for takeoff. A few moments later, in the air, the president walks to the rear of the plane.
He just, leaned in and said, hey. And I said, hey, sir. How's it going? He says, I'm all right. How are you?
And he pointed at our notebooks, said no, meaning this is off the record. You can't report this.
So I said, were you able to reach Mrs. Bush? And he came over and actually patted me on the back, and he said, I just talked to her. Thanks for asking.
There was an antsiness about him. He couldn't wait to get back to Washington. He couldn't wait to do something, say something.
It is late afternoon. Congressional leaders stream back to Washington and gather on Capitol Hill. More than 200 members are waiting.
Congress will convene tomorrow.
As we started to leave the lectern and the area of the steps, somebody on the House side,
someone began to sing God Bless America.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
The president arrives at Andrews Air Force Base.
At approximately 6:42, POTUS boards Marine One looks very somber, but does salute.
On the way to the White House,
the helicopter flew a path this day over the mall, and off the left side window you could see the Pentagon. So it was the president's first eye-to-eye connection with the attack on our country. And he said aloud to nobody in particular, the mightiest building in the world is on fire. That's the 21st century war he just witnessed.
At the White House, government officials wait, with Vice President Cheney and Laura Bush.
The First Lady was there when he arrived, and they embraced.
When you first saw the president that day, when he arrived back, can you describe what he was like, what his mood was like?
Well, for all of us, it was somber. It had been a very emotional day.
Was he angry?
Determined, I would say.
I could tell he was angry. I could tell he was as emotional as any of us about the day.
Darkness falls across the east.
No trade centers. There is no trade centers.
In New York, exhausted rescuers desperately search for survivors.
Although Tower 2 was the second tower to be struck, it was the first to fall down. And that's where my brother was.
Air Force Public Affairs Officer Don Arias last talked to his brother Adam moments before the second tower was struck.
I knew that night that when he didn't come home from work, that he didn't make it. I just knew in my heart that he didn't make it.
And in Washington, National Guard Humvees patrol the streets.
And the city was just different. It was so quiet here. So quiet. There were the helicopters above, but it was still very quiet.
In the White House, the president prepares to address the nation.
The word war crept into the language, and then it went out again, and we argued whether it was the right word.
Well, he used the word during the course of the day that we were at war. My recollection is that he was concerned about that his speech that night needed in part to be reassuring to the American people.
He made a number of edits and suggestions, and he finalized his words, and he addressed the American people from the Oval Office.
The president sitting at his desk on the other side, just moments away from addressing the nation. And in the frame, you can see the opening words to his statement.
It is 8:30 in the evening.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
In the bunker below, CIA Director George Tenet and members of the president's cabinet and national security team watched the speech.
It's one of those, moments where you can hear a pin drop.
We had watched him downstairs in the PIOC, and then he came and joined us, and we, congratulated him. It was the first time we were all together. And it was a tense time, but I recall it also as being a calm time.
The president's normal routine, particularly in a large setting like that, is to start with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and go on through the members who were present to get the latest report.
We really began to hand out assignments for the next day to begin to think about response.
He made it clear that this was not to happen again. I think he used words like, don't ever let this happen again.
There was a task ahead of us. There was a serious job ahead of us. And the president was ready for it. And we were there ready to help him.
And that's where they started planning for what would become war.
I mean, the order was get the troops ready. It was that simple. It was that direct. Get the troops ready.
It is 9:30 p.m. Only 12 hours have passed since the attacks began. A day that dawned full of possibility and promise ends on the eve of war.